I have to preface my introduction with a disclaimer. Some of these facts were gleaned from the internet and therefore have the potential, as with all facts, to be untrue. So this is what I know about Allison Cobb. I know that she is a writer who layers historical research, ecology, personal narrative, and poetry in her work. I know that she rode the Amtrak here from Portland yesterday afternoon. That's where she lives and works for the Environmental Defense Fund. Before that, she lived in Brooklyn, in the time before, during, and after 9/11, the lived catastrophe. She haunted a cemetery there and wrote a book by the same name, Greenwood. Before that, she was born in Los Alamos, New Mexico, of which she also wrote a book, Born To. Before that, I'm not sure where she was. This is what I know of Allison Cobb, and this is what I think. The locational specificity of Born To and Greenwood give us insight into Allison Cobb's creative and intellectual practice, for they show us how paramount the presence of her body in a particular space is to her writing and inquiry. She was really there, and she continued to return. Allison is interested in looking at how personal histories shape collective ones and vice versa. She gestures toward the reverberations, echoes, and shadows that move within the two. Her research for her writing is incredibly rigorous, demonstrating how the facts can be arranged to tell their own truth. She has what I would call temporal impertinence, meaning she wholeheartedly forgoes the mandate to resign oneself to a singular temporality or to disconnect the present state of things from the past. Allison Cobb pulls the thread in both directions. In her work, she details an interconnectivity that spans human, object, place, desire, time, animal, history, war, environment, and power. She does this with the grace of a microscope. I mean, stethoscope. She wonders about private and public space, how they were created and how we continue to create them. Her new project, Plastic, an Autobiography, constellates out from a moment of encounter with a discarded car part. She now picks up plastic wherever she sees it. She is collecting it. She's bringing it home with her. Here, and in a broader sense, she picks up what has been forgotten or elided, what is presently ignored. She picks up this refuse, and in the holding, she encourages it to speak. As she says, but how else exist? How else but to feel a way across the bleeding gap, the gaps, what's left, blanks. How else life, which means remain, continue. I feel very honored to be introducing her to the Evergreen campus today. Without further ado, Allison Cobb.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Hey, you up there. Can you all hear me back there? I feel loud. I could even step away, right? Now, can you still hear me? Okay. Thank you very much, Steph. Where are you? That was a beautiful introduction. That was among the best introductions I've ever had anywhere. Thank you very much. And thank you all for having me here. Thank you to Shaw. Thank you to Miranda. Thank you to Mariana and all the tech folks for making this work. I'm really grateful to be here. I thought what I would do is read a little bit from Greenwood. I know some of you have read it, but some of you haven't, so I thought I would just give you a flavor of it and then talk a little bit about the process of writing it. As Steph described so well, I wrote this book about a 19th century cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, that I lived across the street from in the months and years immediately following September 11th. So I'm just going to read a couple of sections from the beginning of the book. The first year I didn't set foot inside the cemetery. The still smoking hole across the water held my attention, a smell curling inside the minds of the million-headed city, even in sleep. a weather breath resurrects. The second summer, I thought of taking an old boyfriend from LA for a tour. First public opening of Greenwood's catacombs. We crossed the street, joined a flock of Manhattanites looking around at nowhere Brooklyn. The catacombs turn out to be American, a filing system. The long whitewashed tunnel built into a hill exhales its blank air. We shuffle past dark niches, each topped by a soil-clogged skylight. Our flashlights find stack after stack of sealed drawers with plaques, no bodies, no bones. Among the crowd, I see Micah Guerin, who will be kidnapped in Iraq while shooting a documentary about looted artifacts. Fact means not true, but to make. The fact of art a trace. My guest also is named Micah, who prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem. This one made an anti-Bush book out of World War II propaganda posters. Later, the Washington Post will reveal as a lie his detailed description of jumping into Panama as an Army Ranger, a fact I wore like jewelry. On TV, we will watch Micah Guerin's tearful fiancé and West Village neighbors. This one will convince his captors he seeks to expose the truth about the war, and they will let him go. Lucky, a word of mysterious origin. Lucky, we all said, that we came up from the subway after the planes hit, but before the buildings weakened enough to collapse. And then, behead, from the Old English, beheften, be with privative force, plus hephod, head, that rock-ribbed isle. In 1832, a desire awoke in Henry Evelyn Pierpont, grandson of New York State's largest landowner. He envisioned a cemetery on Brooklyn's thickly wooded Gowanus Hills, which he had known in the sporting days of boyhood. The idea was a radical one, inspired by the landmark cemeteries of Europe, such as Père Lachaise, and influenced by Mount Auburn in Boston, the first American cemetery described as rural, a late word, looking back through the fence. Fall, I walk into the cemetery almost daily between trips home to New Mexico for rounds of what is called my mother's chemotherapy, a Frankenstein of healing plus alchemy, to chemical transmuted from the ancient name for Egypt, black earth, or Greek for sap, a quickness, the place. I get lost in it. Acres 478, interred approximately 600,000, plus full fall trees among the oldest left in Brooklyn, a road enclosed in oak light. Every turn makes me take a breath. I dilate and respire, so I am more like trees, a net of breathing. My footsteps sound outside my head and in. At first I'm afraid a little, not of ghosts or seeing bodies, maybe just of staying lost, or of coming across someone live, a cemetery worker, who might ask me what I'm doing here. Soon I understand, which means to lift. The cemetery maintains its own quotidian, a rhythm. See the army of guys in green uniforms, the Greens, I think, engines strapped to backs, blowing leaves off paths. Don't fall, fall. Plus constant funerals. Custom held that people be buried only in the sanctified ground of churches, but epidemics of yellow fever and cholera swept the city, and the dead overflowed the churchyards. A reporter described the graveyard of downtown Manhattan's Trinity Church as saturated with flesh. Bones had to be dug up to make room for new bodies, and New York sometimes had to ship its dead to Boston or Philadelphia, as it now does its trash. A word decayed from the sound of cut down woods, see twig, splinter, and sprig. What language did this blood once speak? I meant it to be hardly words, not trees. Not graveyard, they called them cemeteries, a place to sleep in imitation of the Greeks, at least until the resurrection. I slept, walking for a year, a confined slice. I wrote nothing, read nothing about the place. I meant to disappear, but it kept offering its face to read, a text with blanks and bits floating free. Death itself, a fact the cemetery, which is time and also weather, resurrects. The happy birthday in heaven balloon wrecked on a branch. Abraham Cottrell, 1846, all flesh is grass. The berry-clotted clump of shit by the shore of sylvan water, trace of some wild animal. April 1834. Ralph Waldo Emerson sits in a sunny clearing in Mount Auburn Cemetery and experiences an ecstatic vision. His life seems flying to pieces. His wife has died at age 19. He has left the ministry, the calling of his father and his father before, unable to reconcile himself with the old beliefs. He notes how the pines glitter in the light with their innumerable green needles and thinks of the great star in its ancient passage. He sees the clouds above him and senses the earth beneath him and feels the harmony of all things, himself among them. The New York Public Library creaks. It breathes, sucking call slips through brass tubes to an invisible vault below our feet. The ancient book comes forth, encased in a cardboard envelope, this flap first. Book veiled for its resurrection like carved urns on tombs, half draped in cloth, a sexual peeking out. I peel back leaf after leaf. Rural cemeteries grew out of England's picturesque landscape tradition, but the transcendentalists gave them a distinctly American character. They called on citizens to leave the blighted city and immerse themselves in the continent's untouched nature, space, the air, the river, each leaf. The transcendentalists fetishized the wilderness as it vanished before their eyes. The population grew tenfold during Emerson's lifetime. Railroads stitched the frontier closed. Factories bled smoke across New England. Here's globalization for you. A businessman in Boston shipped ice cut from Walden Pond to Calcutta. By the time Emerson published Nature in 1836, much of the primeval New England forest was gone, the vast pine stands of the Ohio Valley about to fall to the saw. He watched mountain lions, gray wolves, bison, and elk disappear from the land. Against this backdrop, rural cemeteries offered oases of permanence and tranquility, soil silence and leaf light. They provided a sanitized version of the natural world and obscured among the glancing foliage the decaying human body, itself a wilderness. As institutions, rural cemeteries reduced transcendentalism to a prescription for breathing clean air and experiencing romantic sentiments, loneliness, melancholy, hope. But Emerson cleaved to the wilds of the mind, glad to the brink of fear. I want to go there. So that's just a little bit of Greenwood. Thank you. That's so nice. So I thought I would show a slideshow that talks a little bit about the process of making Greenwood, and then I thought what I would do is talk about my current project that Steph also mentioned, the Autobiography of Plastic project, and then read a little bit from that more current work. So something amazing is about to happen. Okay. Everybody still hear me okay if I'm back here? Okay, got a thumbs up. So Greenwood, how Greenwood came to be. Let's see here. Let's see if we can make this full screen. There we go. So this is a picture, of the front gates of the Greenwood Cemetery, and I lived across the street from these gates. I certainly did not set out to write a book about a cemetery, but in the aftermath of September 11th, I, along with many other writer friends that I knew in New York, had this sudden impulse to document things. Our world had transformed, and I think there was this desire to figure out where was this place that we were now. This isn't a totally great picture, but it's from the space station, and it's a picture of the smoke coming out from the Twin Towers in Lower Manhattan. And if you can see the dark green spot, I don't have a pointer, but in the middle of the photo there, that's Greenwood Cemetery. And then the green spot right below it is its neighbor, Prospect Park. And you can tell that they create this large open green space in the midst of this really dense city that's Brooklyn. It's the largest open space in Brooklyn, and the two combined are 1,000 acres, which I just learned is the size of Evergreen's land. It's also the size of Central Park. So it was this incredibly beautiful open space that was across the street from me. So I would just walk around in there. And this is a picture of one of the ponds in Greenwood. As I was walking around in Greenwood, following its winding paths, I was thinking about following paths back through history in order to figure out how it was we had arrived at this 21st century metropolis that had just itself become a cemetery. But as I was doing this walking and thinking about history, the cemetery itself kept sort of calling my attention and speaking to me. And the great thing about a historic cemetery, if you're a writer, is that it's a museum of artwork, and it's also a text. There's legible surfaces all over a cemetery that one can engage with. I think this one says, "the best woman that ever lived." So these wonderful sort of poignant bits of text around the cemetery. And in the case of Greenwood, it was also an arboretum and a wildlife sanctuary. So finally, after about a year of walking around in the cemetery almost every day, I started to actually do some research about the cemetery itself and find out about it. And as I was researching the cemetery, I was just picking up threads that interested me and following them and sort of winding around with them. As a creative writer rather than a professional historian, I didn't feel an obligation to write some kind of comprehensive history about the cemetery. And in fact, the official history of Greenwood had already been written, that existed. So what I was interested in doing was just sort of following my interests, picking up little threads and clues. And those of you who have read Greenwood know that it ranges very far away from the cemetery to the history of the American forest and Paris in the 19th century and orangutans in Borneo. It travels a lot, and I thought I would just actually read a short section from later in the book to give folks a sense of how it ranges. This is a passage it's about a trip that Ralph Waldo Emerson made to Paris in 1850. In Paris, Emerson made little mention of the political turmoil that Parisians called the time of riots. Emerson found Paris a loud, modern New York of a place. He took refuge in the cabinet of natural history with its formal gardens and cases of anatomical preparations, all of nature categorized according to the latest science. The new classification system improved on Linnaeus by revealing hidden connections. Each species, before seemingly isolated and random, was related to every other. Wandering through the museum, Emerson experienced an ecstatic revelation. He sensed the continuity of life. "I feel the centipede in me," he wrote, "caiman, carp, eagle, and fox." Half a century earlier, at the public gardens in Palermo, the writer Goethe had a similar epiphany. After years of carefully studying plants in all stages of growth, Goethe realized in a sudden flash of insight that what we call the leaf is the essential organ of the plant. Present in the seed, this bit of tissue contains nodes or eyes through which it transforms to fulfill every function: calyx, petal, pistil. Instead of discrete parts, the plant consists of this single substance, constantly transforming itself. Emerson returned from Europe without a home, without a career, struggling to be a writer, and comparing himself unfavorably to Shakespeare. But he carried the inspiration of the museum with him, and influenced by Goethe, he comforted himself that even magnificent works must grow from small beginnings. Every leaf contains the eyes which are sufficient to originate a forest. Louis Philippe, the citizen king, pledged to uphold the French Constitution, which mandated freedom of speech. The monarchy justified censoring the caricaturists by asserting that drawings went beyond speech by speaking to the eyes. To destroy the jungle that blinded them, US soldiers sprayed more than 10 million gallons of Agent Orange on Vietnam. The chemicals spur rapid division in plant cells that function like stem cells in humans, transforming into many types of tissue. Unable to sustain the uncontrolled growth of leaves, stems, and shoots, the plant quickly blackens and dies all the way back to the root. So you can see there's kind of an idiosyncratic passage through history there. But I was committed to doing historical research and documenting what I was doing. I actually did write a more poetic and creative, I won't say creative, but a more poetic and less researched version of the Greenwood manuscript that I ended up just trashing because I wasn't pleased with it. I wanted to weave together these disparate threads and figure out how they all interwove to make us arrive at this current moment in our American culture. But I was having sort of a hard time keeping control of all of this documentation I was amassing as I was researching. And so what I started to do was hang the bits of research up on my wall, literally just cut them out and pin them up. And then I organized them by different threads or themes. So that's New York City, and that's Birds of Paradise. And then at some point, I hit on the idea of arranging each page as a visual unit, as some kind of visual arrangement that was pleasing to me. And so what I would do is literally stand in front of my wall of research, pick pieces that I wanted to juxtapose, and then arrange them visually on the page. And here's a picture of 2 pages from Greenwood where you can see that kind of visual arrangement. The problem with that is that I was arranging these on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And the book in its published size is not that size. I think it's 5 by 7. And so much of the visual arrangement of Greenwood was actually lost in the public version. There are a lot of partial pages and white spaces in the book because of that. People tell me it doesn't make any difference, that no one would ever know that this was a visual arrangement except for me. But it was a good lesson for me to learn that if you are going to work visually as a writer, you need to think about the size at which your work might actually end up. So I wrote this book over about 6 years, and it would seem that because it's so place-based that I would need to be immersed all the time in the cemetery. That's a bird watching trip in Greenwood. But I actually spent extended periods of time away from Brooklyn and away from Greenwood when I was writing the book. And I finished it after I had moved here to Portland, Oregon in 2009. And those of you who've read Greenwood know that the last section of the book really moves away from the documentary, and it's a much more poetic and personal account of my own experience of September 11th and coming to terms with that. And I think in a lot of ways I needed to leave the city and leave the cemetery and have some distance from that place in order to write that. So it's kind of a sort of strange fact about this book about a cemetery that in order to finish it, I needed to be 2,000 miles away from it. So that's a bit about the process of Greenwood and how it happened. And I can move on and talk about the plastic piece, but maybe I'll stop and just see if anyone has some questions or comments about this bit. While I switch my presentations.
I'm wondering, you just talked about the last part that's more poetic. There's like 3 different negations that happen in that part that I noticed, and I was just wondering if you could talk about those at all?
So sorry. The question is, the last part that's more personal and poetic has 3 different negations that happen.
Yeah.
School me. I don't know what you mean.
Oh, I mean, it just like suddenly says like no, and then it's like you negate previous writing that you had just written.
Oh, yeah. Well, so what happens in that section, I think, is kind of in some ways a rejection of the documentary, right? That's more like I'm just kind of having an emotional response. But there's also a bit of a distrust of any language at all to be able to convey what I'm trying to convey. So I think that that's part of that gesture. What do you think?
That sounds good to me.
Acceptable answer.
I was curious about influences on the form that the book took, like other books that you read.
Okay, so the question is about influences on the form of Greenwood. I really like a writer named Susan Howe. I don't know if others of you have read her. She also does a very idiosyncratic take on historical documents that are at the same time well-researched, and then intersperses them with poetry. So Susan Howe was definitely a model for me. Ralph Waldo Emerson himself was a model, even though I have a kind of conflicted relationship with him in the book. He was certainly a model for me. One of my enduring models who really writes nothing like that is a poet named Alice Notley. If you know her, the reason she's a model is that she has this kind of incredible ability to speak in a poetic language that feels as if it's coming like right out of the center of her being, rather than being filtered through an intellect, which kind of seems the opposite of Greenwood, and maybe that's in some ways why she's a model.
With the research, how much of it was directed and chosen? How much of it just sort of grew out of itself organically, like things that just suggested things that perhaps seemed unconnected and that you connected in yourself, and how much you actually chose to go down particular paths for whatever distance?
The question is how much of the research was directed and planned, and how much was a sort of spontaneous following of threads. That's a really good question, and it's kind of hard to answer, because something that seems planned could arise out of a spontaneous, like I would get ideas to follow some research in a sort of programmatic way because it had arisen. All the research that I did arose spontaneously out of topics that came out of my interest in the cemetery. So there's research into the cemetery, they're called landscape cemeteries or rural cemeteries, that movement, but that also led me to transcendentalism, which also led me to the American forest, so one thing did lead to another, but then there was a point where I was like, I need to know a lot more about the origin of property rights in the United States. So that would become sort of, I need to find out like what the sort of like 4 foundational texts are and read those and get a little mini, seminar for myself on that. So there was a kind of a both. But again, as a not a professional historian and someone actually like who was never trained really to use a research library, a lot of it was very intuitive as well. Yeah.
It was interesting to me that you said you wrote another version that was more poetic, because the poetry in the book felt really like it was like totally necessary when it came. And I was wondering how you chose, how you chose what to leave and what to remove from that part.
From the poet.
From the poetry, yeah.
So the question is about what I chose to leave in terms of the poem that ends the book, and what I chose to leave out of it, since I had written a poetic manuscript and then rejected it. That's the kind of question. I knew for a long time the book was going to end with a poem, and again, in just an intuitive way. I knew that the book throughout has a sort of suspicious take on documentary, even though it is written in the documentary style. It also tries to sort of break down that style and reveal its seams a little bit. And so I knew that the language would break down at the end, but I didn't know exactly how that would happen until I actually did it. And I wrote the end very quickly and actually didn't, which is not that common for me, or wasn't at the time, write very slowly and methodically. I wrote it quickly, and I don't think I left anything out of it, just sort of came out that way. So, yeah. But I think I had to write the whole rest of the book in order to get there. So.
As you were reading, I was thinking of Spontaneous Particulars, which is Susan Howe's latest. I'm wondering if you would speak particularly about that and the fact that it came from the Blaney lecture, because I haven't even seen the published version. Can you say more about how your work mirrors or mimics her use of both materiality and like very abstract textuality, and the two are right next to each other?
So the question is about Susan Howe and her most recent book, Spontaneous Particulars, which is about working in archives. And the question is about the marriage of very abstract work combined with very material things. Is that right? Your questions are hard to rephrase because you're all so smart. I haven't read Spontaneous Particulars either, but I saw Susan Howe give that lecture, and it's great. It's like her love letter to archives. She has all, did you see the lecture?
It's actually online. You have to Google the Blaney lecture, and it's available online. You can actually see.
Oh, okay. I saw her do it in Portland. She has this slideshow where she shows like William Carlos Williams, who's a poet who is also a doctor, a prescription pad with a poem scribbled on it, and all of these like wonderful material things of ephemera from the past that she's ecstatic about them. Like people, I love it. I love Emerson for his ecstatic revelations. Like I described two of them in this book. I love it when people are enthusiasts in that way, that they feel overtaken by something. And it is really her love of archives in a digital age. Like she's sort of arguing for the life of libraries and the ability to go and have this, what for her is a religious experience of seeing and touching these items. And I did very much have that experience in the New York Public Library, which is open to anyone except that it's closing. So the New York Public Library is closing down its public research room where I did all the research for Greenwood. The one on 42nd Street, the main library, will no longer have a public reading room there, and the books will not be kept there. It to me is just like a death. I mean, I'm just so sad about it. It will become a circulating library, but it's not, I mean, that is like a world-class research institution that you don't have to go to a college to go into. And as someone who's not an academic, that's hugely important. Like I couldn't have written Greenwood without that book. So I've gone off onto the materiality of libraries and archives. But I think what makes Susan Howe such a powerful writer is that she's very interested in ideas and abstract notions also of how we got to this culture where we are in American culture, but it's always very grounded in the material and in the body and in emotion. And that's the kind of thing that, the juxtaposition that I'm interested in and that I think makes her work so powerful. So I might just, let me check the time, maybe, okay, one more and then maybe I'll go on to this presentation. We could continue the conversation after that one.
A moment ago you talked about your kind of suspicion of documentary work and how you wanted to show the seams, and so I'm interested in how you chose to format your citations in the work, using a lot of italics to show where some citations were, but not really directly citing in the body of the text. And I think that's interesting in conjunction with your comment about showing the seams, because I think those seams are not quite explicit, they're kind of ghostly, and you don't really know sometimes until you get to the back of the book what is citation and what is not. So I was wondering how you came up with your citational format, and if that emerged kind of organically or if you struggled with it.
So the question is about, since I'm interested in showing the seams of documentary writing, how did I choose the format I used to cite my sources? And the way the sources are cited is in the back of the book, there's just a phrase from the page, and then the source is cited by the phrase. So rather than being numbered endnotes or numbered footnotes, is that what you're wondering about that? And so it's a less like really direct. Yeah, so we were actually talking about this last night. It's funny, and it also has to do with the material object. The book was end-noted. I use numbered endnotes when I wrote the book, in part because there's that was the best way to keep track of this volume of research. But the publisher found that ugly, the numbered ugly, because it interfered with the visual look of the page, and so he asked me to do something different. So that's what I did, is cite the endnotes by just using phrases from the book. I don't personally, when I read scholarly books, I love a numbered endnote or footnote because it's so direct. And I love ebooks for that reason, because you can click on the endnote and get right there. So it does create. You do have to sort of wander through the book in order to get to those notes. And I decided that I'm happy with that for the book because of the way it wanders, but it was more about the physical object. So I'll talk for a brief bit about the Autobiography of Plastic, which came about in kind of an opposite way from Greenwood. So the idea for writing the book Greenwood arose slowly over a year of walking around in the cemetery. The Autobiography of Plastic came up because I just declared to some poet friends of mine in Portland one day that I was going to write the Autobiography of Plastic. But I didn't have any idea what that actually meant. And I needed to spend some time figuring that out. So the reason I got the idea, I think, is because I work for an environmental organization. That's my paying work. And I was hearing a lot of information about the extent of plastic contamination around the planet. And probably a lot of you have heard similar things about these ocean currents that travel around the world's oceans, and in the middle, plastic accumulates. You've probably specifically heard about the North Pacific garbage patch, where there's a big bunch of plastic that's maybe the size of Texas in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You've probably seen images like plastic accumulating on these remote Pacific islands, and then wildlife consuming it. There are albatross chicks that are fed bits of plastic by their parents. Scientists think it's because there are things like flying fish eggs attached. But the albatross can't process it, and so they die. And there's a photographer called Chris Jordan who's taken a series of very haunting photos you may have seen of albatross chicks decaying around the plastic in their innards. And you've probably seen things like this. And then it's not just the oceans. There are climate researchers taking ice core samples from the Arctic who have found plastic in every one of their samples. That's a picture of the little plastic particle in the ice. Plastic is in food. Plastic is in beer. A recent study of the top brands of German beer in Germany found every single sample contained tiny particles of plastic. And unsurprisingly, then, plastic is in people. Nearly every American tested had industrial chemicals, including newborns who are born with hundreds of chemicals in their bloodstreams passed by their mothers. So all of these kind of terrible thoughts were going around in my mind when I made this declaration, Autobiography of Plastic. And my friends were like, that is a good idea, you should write that. And so I applied for a grant, and I was like, I'm gonna write the Autobiography of Plastic. And the grant people said, that's a good idea, and they gave me some money. But I still actually had no clue like what this was gonna be. But about that time, I got to take a family trip to Hawaii, to the Big Island. And at the very southern tip of Hawaii, there's a piece of land that pokes out into that Great Pacific garbage patch. And plastic accumulates there literally by the ton. People who live there call it Junk Beach. And so I got to go to this beach, which is very hard to get to. There's no road, and tourists don't go there. But, and spend some time. This is my partner filling a plastic bottle she found on the beach with just plastic that was there. I'd never seen anything like this, and actually the photos don't do a great job of conveying the scale of what was there. And so I thought, okay, so this book is going to be about how I travel to these remote places on the planet where plastic accumulates and bear witness to this thing that a lot of people don't get to see. But I didn't have actually any idea how I was going to do that because I didn't have the money to do that. The grant was not that big, and I didn't really have the time to do that. So I was kind of lying around one day despairing about ever being able to write this book. It was a Friday the 13th. And I decided to stop moping after a while and get up and take my dog for a walk. And I opened the front door, and literally in front of me on the grass was this white plastic ring. And it struck me, oh, my house forms a coast too. There's plastic washing through here all the time. And so I just started noticing it. And then I started picking it up. I started collecting all the plastic that I found on my daily dog walk and taking a picture of it and recording it on my website. So I was doing that. I have a good friend who's also a writer, who's one of those great friends who's always challenging me, like, what are you doing? Like, what does all this plastic add up to? What does it mean? And so one day, kind of in frustration, I just declared to her that I felt like you could probably account for the full existence of every piece of plastic I pick up by one of three words: grief, fear, or desire. And then I decided to put that to the test by starting to label the plastic that I was finding. So I was doing that, and then I got a gift from the universe. I went out the front door one day, and this large plastic car part was tangled against my fence. That's my dog Quincy on the right, and that's the car part. And as Steph mentioned, I took the car part inside and developed a kind of unhealthy, obsessive relationship with this piece of plastic. It moves around my house. Like, it's in the living room for a while, it's in the bedroom for a while. And I started to research this piece of plastic. I decided I wanted to find out everything I could about it. So I made friends with this guy named Rocky at the local Honda parts dealer, and he helped me figure out it comes from a 1995 Honda Odyssey minivan. It's the first minivan that Honda ever built specifically for Americans. They sent some researchers over here to interview Americans about what is their ideal form of transportation, and it turns out that the platonic ideal for Americans was a minivan. And it's called the Odyssey, which is great for poetry, but I wanted to know more about this car part. I wanted to know about the factory in Japan where it was made. I wanted to know about the factory where the plastic was made. I wanted to know about the oil refinery where the oil was heated and cracked apart into molecules that would make the plastic. I wanted to know about the hole in the ground where the oil came from. I felt like if I could just do all this investigating and this documenting and understanding, I could come to some kind of knowledge about what we're supposed to do now, about the fact that we live in the midst of this ecological catastrophe, plastic contamination, global warming, species extinction. Maybe I would get some clue about what we're going to do about that. But I was running into complete dead ends. No one cares or is able to say anything about what is basically a piece of garbage that was manufactured in Japan 20 years ago. Like, it's really difficult to get information about that. So at about that time, I went off to a writing retreat, my first ever, in the desert of Eastern Oregon at a place called Playa, which I recommend applying to if any of you like to do art or writing retreats. It's beautiful there, but there's nothing there. There's no internet connection. There's no cell phone service, and there's no town, so I couldn't do any research. There's also no plastic. Well, there actually is plastic because there's plastic everywhere, but some artists who were there before me had already collected the plastic and turned it into art, so I couldn't collect any plastic. So I was just sitting around, like, thinking about my relationship to this card part and what was I doing and what it meant. And I got a revelation, which is what's supposed to happen in the desert, right? I had this revelation, which is that I am the car part. We're the same thing. Both of us are made from carbon-based molecules. Both of us have been shaped at the level of those molecules by global capitalism. We have the same industrial chemicals inside of us. And both of us are reduced in that system of global capital to our use value, right? To our production. The car part, as long as it's functional, it's fine. Once it ceases to be functional and ends up against my fence, it's waste, garbage. It doesn't matter that its molecules are gonna last for 500 or 1,000 years. It's become excess to the system. And human communities are like that too, right? As long as you can participate productively in the economy, you're pretty good. But if you can't or you won't, jobless, houseless, poor artist, poet, occupier, you become excess to a system that's only interested in utilitarian value. So once I recognized that I was the same thing as the car part, I just started writing poetry. I just turned away from this project of documenting and investigating and explaining, and I just spent 2 weeks in the desert like writing poems, and I've been writing poems since then, and I think of them as just kind of a cry, like a cry of mourning and protest in some ways about this situation that we're in. I will go back to the plastic book and finish it, but the moment seemed to call for just protest. So I thought what I would do is read just a snippet of the actual plastic book so you can hear what it sounds like, and then a couple of poems, and then we could talk some more. I'm just going to read the one section of the book that talks about the finding of the plastic car part. It's called The Thing, and it mentions the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. The thing turned up in a corner of the yard, just outside the fence. I found it when I went out in the afternoon to take Quincy for a walk. Curved and black, plastic, 4 feet long, a foot at its widest. I thought at first it was a car bumper. I put it in the grass in front of the porch. The next morning it was still there. I sat next to it in the sun and looked close. I was thinking of Heidegger, his essay called The Thing. He writes that distance disappears and all things come equally close because of technology. In 1949, he meant airplanes, the radio, TV. Things congeal around us, the uniform, distanceless. But this does not make anything present. The only way to approach a thing, to bring it near, is by sidling up to it, by thinking around or through what appears obvious. He performs this kind of meditation on the thingness of a clay jug. So I thought of meditating on this car part. I tried, looking at it, to think of something not obvious. Instead, I saw the albatross carcass bursting with plastic. I don't know why I put that image in the poem, Nothing. I am the no and the yes, a line I stole from Anna Sobelman's first book. It has lived in my mind for years, an itch or splinter, contaminant. In the poem, Sobelman follows the line with a qualifying phrase. She narrows it, makes it domestic. I want the raw declaration hanging there on the turn of itself. I am the no and the yes. So this, the albatross filled with plastic, is it part nothing because it's dead, the door not there? Maybe. More, it gives rise to a no. It is ugly, a painful image. I want it to go. But it persists. It pierces the uniform distanceless of my life, like the no and the yes. So that's The Thing. And then I'm just going to read you a few poems. The first one is, I wrote in the desert of Oregon. It was near there that some anthropologists found the oldest segments of human DNA discovered in North America, and it pushed back the knowledge of when humans were on this continent by several thousand years. So this makes a reference to that. It's called The Things You Loved. I lived to haunt you, to ask you to hold this oldest piece of human DNA beneath your tongue. It's shit, dug up from wave-cut caves in the Summer Lake basin of Oregon, mixed with red fox, wolf, coyote, animals they ate or later came to pee on their remains. Hold this and think the thing you love the most, what you most want inside you, mixed in with your excrement in 15,000 years when someone digs it up. Think the thing you loved so much. You conjured it in labs to live inside the flesh of every animal, to saturate your own well-fatted flanks, king of all the creatures. So these must be the names for things you loved so much. You peed on all the earth and all its living things, which you then ate to concentrate its thickest dose inside your pearl-white fat and rearrange your DNA and gene expression. Aldrin, dieldrin, DDT, Mirex, toxaphene, and TCDD, heptachlor, hexachlorobenzene, and the PCBs nestled in your genes with you, and chlordicone, and the hexachlorocyclohexanes, all the things you loved. This is Poem of Force, and it makes reference to the fact, as Steph mentioned, that I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is where the atomic bombs were built and which is still a nuclear lab. The shining part of shields and weapons and up-armored trucks. The glitter sprays of sun I hold my hands up in, a kind of scream from dreams. I throw my flame-burnt bird-beak heart. No hope is what the mother told the press, a tune that has no words and never stops. The bullet works by hitting with such force, the force of a Mack truck, though it's just a 1-inch slug of densest lead. It leaves a trail like a freeway crash through bone and flesh because it flies so fast. It's a primitive technology, a pointed bit of soft and silver poison metal wrapped inside a gleaming coat of copper. A clip of a white man in a suit aiming a gun in each hand precedes the news report. It's an ad for a TV show on TNT called Legends. At the office, the old assistant put a sign up that said, "Force yourself. Force yourself down to the ground and spread your legs and keep your hands above your head," the cop kept screaming. A helmet and a gas mask make the man seem only weapon. The word force means body of armed men. My town holds some of the planet's most dangerous substances that kill by moving invisibly through cells and scrambling the atoms that make up flesh and bone. A mercenary army guards the stuff with guns. We used to park at a gate to the lab to make out and wait. Before too long, a guard would come with gun and light and shine it on our skin, and sometimes let us stay there, steaming up the panes at the edge of the cliff where the radiation leaked into rock of hardened ash from an ancient volcano. They never scared me once. I never had to think of force from sun-glassed men in uniform. A white and privileged chick, I always cried if I got stopped, and usually I knew the cop, Officer Grecian, Captain Tom, church members and friends. They almost always let me off. The violence I knew came in much more intimate forms, without a gun, in homes and cars. He wrote that asking men to stop the work on the atomic bomb once it began and then refrain from using it on people would be like asking a boxer to sense in the heat of the fight the moment his opponent lost his strength and started the slide to defeat and stop pummeling him with his fists into unconsciousness. Can you hear the global engine gunning, getting louder? Once it's out and hot and loaded up, it's just too hard to stop. And then the last one I'll read is called Sorry, and it makes reference again to the albatross, which is both the plastic albatross and also is a reference to the Coleridge poem Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is the poem where the sailor shoots the albatross, and then the ship gets becalmed and everyone on it starts to die, and they blame it on the sailor who has killed this bird that they saw as a good omen, and so they force him to wear it around his neck. And that's like we talk about the albatross around my neck as a burden. Sorry. The albatross hardly showed up in that poem. I cleaned out after it the whole time, weeping, mouth so dried out I had to suck from my own salty blindness to say I'm sorry about all the screaming Jeezy fans in the bank that used to be your bedroom. I mean Jesus, screaming Jesus fans, where you shared your last love with your last lover before she died. That was low, I know, like Subway low, like bread puffed up with yoga mat chemicals. Yes, I did steal everyone's day Turnamol. I did it last summer, in my sleep, on fire, on the landline, just a normal phone call, carrying the voice of that albatross with its stinking breath from the afterlife. I'm inside it still, falling down to my tiny library of angel-headed monster cells, weeping in their cancer juice, shooting chapbook after chapbook at Justin Bieber, screaming, "We love you, please don't get up just for us, your fans, forever kickboxing gods in the face so you can relax with your scissorp." I drop these names so my young friends will not forget me. Here's one, the Jewish refugee who stood on a street corner in London in 1933. He used to soak in the tub for 3 hours a day to get ideas. This day, the idea struck him standing on a street corner in London for a nuclear chain reaction, which he quickly patented. He wrote his own 10 commandments. Number 4, do not destroy what you cannot create. Number 5, untranslatable German pun. Things that make you go, to quote, quoting, The man, Leo Szilard, slapped his lizard gloves against his thigh, fist-bumped Einstein, and went off to build that bomb. Okay, no, that's historically irresponsible. Please don't repeat my errors, Justin Bieber. Please don't repeat your own. Please don't patent your own scissor cups out of styrofoam. No, really, I worry. I'm lying here with this stinking albatross carcass. It was never a burden in the poem. It never had that physical heft. The bird around the neck is more like Hester Prynne, the 1995 Demi Moore version. The scarlet A, a mark of guilt, but not even subtle or symbolic, like, wow, I know what you did last summer. It's hanging there, rotting on your chest. For real, I know what you did. You can dress it up with a patent and drown it in cough syrup. I can still smell it. Thank you, everybody. So I think we have time, so we could discuss more. I'm going to grab my water bottle. Questions about plastic collecting or poems? There's one.
In the movie Examined Life, Slavoj Zizek is standing in a heap of rubbish. And
Yeah.
he says, as environmentalists, we have to learn to love things.
Yeah.
Not cut off our roots to it.
Yeah.
And maybe does that mean we should turn the albatross around our neck into a fashion statement? And so how can we go about that?
The comment is the Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher, made a movie called The Examined Life, and in it he stands in a garbage heap. I think it's in New Jersey, right? And he talks about how we, as environmentalists, we have to learn to love our trash, and then your comment is we should turn the albatross around our neck into a fashion statement. I think that Žižek doesn't go far enough. I think we need to not love our trash. We need to love our trash as ourselves and recognize we're the same thing. So I would say recognize we are the albatross. I don't know how that extends to the albatross. Maybe you can tell me.
Wondering, like, if you have kind of a coping mechanism for like collecting. 'Cause I've been like having this really hard time because I've been collecting my trash because I have a like and I feel like I'm becoming a hoarder in a sense. So like it's like socially unacceptable. And also, like, it makes my life complicated and not good, like, so do you, like, and you've been collecting plastics, so do you have any way to, like...
This is a woman asking for advice because she collects her trash. She fears becoming a hoarder. Why are you collecting your trash?
Like, for the reasons that, like, sorry.
For art?
No, I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm crying. It's just
for personal, strong emotional reasons.
Sorry, I didn't mean to move on.
That's okay. Yeah, we'll move on. What her basic question was about was handling the very difficult question, which we were also talking about, of handling waste that comes into our lives and what to do about it. And I was saying that I don't know. I have plastic and garbage bags in my shed because I am not sure how to get rid of it. And She was asking about an outlet for that, and I think art is one outlet, talking to each other about what kinds of solutions we can come up with to this pretty difficult reality where we find ourselves now.
I'm curious if you have a relationship to the idea of the object as easily disposable, and also the, like, you talk about this a little bit in Greenwood, like the need to make the grieving process like compact and like to make it like easy to fit into like capitalist society, this like sort of like hurry up and heal ideology or like just coping weird sort of idea that gets perpetuated, and what you think that does like to the living human body if that somehow makes it more disposable.
So I think you've just shared a really interesting insight, which is the relationship between the kind of capitalist commandment to grieve and get over it quickly, which we heard a lot after September 11th, to go shopping and that kind of thing. And if, you know, the terrace of one, if you don't go shopping. And the thing about plastic being disposable, that we don't want to have it around, just get rid of it. And you were wondering about what that does, those conjunction of those things in some ways does to the human body.
Right. Like, I feel like you write about the human body in Greenwood almost as like a disposable commodity, that, and like the idea of like reserving property and like propriety for the disposed human body.
I think it makes us sick, right? I think it makes us sick, doesn't it? And so we need to find ways to process grief and be able to live with it and share it and get support for it and have it be acceptable in the same ways that we need to find a solution to our waste. Someone was saying to me the other day, we have a really deep relationship to waste that we don't like to acknowledge. So being able to spend some time with that, I think. And it's difficult in a society that doesn't want to even think about waste or grief. So, yeah.
I'm not sure if this is a question necessarily, but just relating to that other question about holding on to one's trash. In my program, we read part of Jane Bennett's *A Vibrant Matter*, and I also read part of it in my program last year, and I watched a lecture that she did online called Artistry and Agency in a World of Vibrant Matter, The Powers of the Hoard. And in it, she talks a lot about hoarding and hoarders and like the television show and how all of the symptoms of the hoarder is put on the person and not seen as greater symptoms of living in a global capital society and being like having these like visions and grief of excess. And I think that it's interesting to, I think it's a good turn to take these feelings of the person, something psychologically wrong with the person versus something wrong with the system in which they're being in. And it also a lot of the quotes that she takes from it, from the television show, are people talking about how things just they just took over, or they just started showing up, or they just started appearing, and that really reminded me of the universe's gift to you of like finding the shore, the plastic shore on the edge of your home. Mm-hmm. And I guess if someone is like thinking really critically of the things that begin to appear around them and not knowing what to do with them, I would recommend reading Jane Bennett or watching this lecture, because it was really powerful, and it's something that I also struggle with too, and coming from like a lower class, below the poverty line family, and living in places where everything is so congested with garbage and things, and the buildings in which you live are even made of aluminum, like a dumpster would be, and they're all rectangular, you know? It's like constantly trying to prove your utility in society, to prove you're not waste, and then the modes of survival is not just about food and shelter, but about being able to collect the symbols that prove that you exist and are like a generative part of society.
What you're saying is so great. I'm hoping people can hear it. Can you folks up there hear? Oh, good. I'm so glad. Yeah, I mean, a bunch of tremendous insights. I think Jane Bennett and her book, Vibrant Matter, are really good things to read. And I don't know the name of the video. Say it again.
It was called Artistry and Agency in the World of Vibrant Matter, Powers of the Horde.
Powers of the Horde. Okay, so probably if you searched Vibrant Matter, you would find that one too. I think that you make a crucial connection between the blaming the individual for these practices of hoarding when we live in a culture that is so supportive of that and drives us to that, and also the fact of class and having to try to assert your value, and also the importance of material possessions in our culture and the idea of accumulating. Yeah, thank you. Other thoughts?
I mean, it seems obvious now why it's called The Autobiography of Plastic, realizing that we are plastic. But it seems like you came up with that title before your realization. So I was just wondering, why autobiography before you realized that?
So the question is, why autobiography when I didn't know what I was doing? Like, why would I have picked that? I think, well, don't you have this experience that your intuition is smarter than your conscious brain? I think I had some intuition about that, and then it took me a long time to figure out what was the reasoning behind it. And I think it's still complex in some ways, what that actually means, but yeah.
I was curious, when you lived in Brooklyn, when you're out there, did you ever go down to Glass Beach?
Question about going to Glass Beach in Brooklyn, which I've never heard of.
Okay, so it's right across from Rockaway, right before you go over the bridge to Rockaway. And it's covered in sea glass and little bottles and manufactured things that have washed up in this because of what a particular occurrence or wherever things were dumped. And it's trash. And it's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
It seems like this aesthetically beautiful object, and yet it is, you know, a 100-year prior equivalent to the plastic beaches. And where that line is between beautiful artifact of garbage and trash and what the useless things, like I really think about it a lot when I've been there. Like, this is a garbage beach, and it's gorgeous.
Yeah, so there's a comment about the Glass Beach in Brooklyn and how beautiful that is, and where is the line between garbage and beautiful? Well, it's a line that gets blurred. There's lots of art going on now using plastic, and art itself is very reliant on, like, acrylic paints are plastic, right? I always think about the material of the visual arts that is so invested in plastic in some ways. There's a fundamental distinction, though, between glass and plastic, which is that plastic, the molecular collections in plastic, the molecular connections in plastic are formed in laboratories under heat and pressure that would not exist outside of a factory, and so there is no organism that's evolved to break that down, and that's the reason plastic lasts for so long. There's no way for any organism to pull apart those molecules and get fuel out of them. So that's one sort of key difference, and the reason plastic kind of becomes a scourge. Because even if it breaks down and gets smaller and smaller, those tiny molecular connections still persist. So that's why we have what they call microplastic, which is in things like beer. You can't see it, but it's there. Is there anybody way up there who has questions? Oh, there's one.
First of all, thank you for saying all these things, and everyone else also. And Greenwood's been really big for me in the past couple days that I've been reading it. And I was wondering, maybe this Autobiography of Plastic kind of answers this, but what it was like to more intentionally immerse yourself in death, in the archives and in the cemetery, and spend all that time there, which can be like really overwhelming, and how maybe that changed your perception of death, or how you incorporate this part of life into your life?
So the question is about whether spending all that time with death in Greenwood changed my perceptions of death. It's funny that, I mean, I knew that it was a cemetery, obviously, but my experience of Greenwood wasn't one of death. It's such an alive place. It's so filled with wildlife and growing things and interesting changes through all the seasons, that for me it was very life-giving. And my mother would be like, "Are you still writing that poem about a cemetery? Like, that's so depressing, honey." But for me, the investigation of Greenwood and uncovering all of these connections was very life-giving and exciting. I find the whole ceremony of death that would happen in Greenwood a little bit strange and alienating, where they would use astroturf to cover the raw dirt and, you know, all the things that we know about the sort of funeral and death industry in our culture that are designed to really distance us from the dead body. So I didn't actually feel like Greenwood brought me that much closer to death, but it definitely kept me alive for a few years when I was in a pretty precarious position emotionally, depressed and suffering post-traumatic stress from without really knowing that's what was happening. Thanks. Anybody else way up there? One in the front row.
So, what's been your connection with plastic since you've started this book?
What's been my connection with plastic since I've started the book?
Has it decreased? What's been your connection since?
Obsessive. I can't stop seeing it. I have an obsessive connection with plastic. And I'm really like tired of it actually, because it's always there. And once there's a thing that you kind of can't look away from that you would like to look away from, I've actually lessened my collecting a little bit just for a little bit of self-preservation in a way. It's a little bit tiring. I have not stopped using plastic in my own life. I mean, I know there are people who work really hard to do that, and it's nearly impossible to do, but I've become much more aware of it. So. Good to you.
I was curious about, you talked for like a second or two about the 3 separate categories of the litter that you find, and I was wondering if you could talk more about that, 'cause I was picturing more of a Venn diagram or something than the thing you showed, just because I don't know how cleanly distinct those categories are, or like, you know, when I saw like the earrings, I'm like, yeah, grief, fear, again, desire, or when I saw the dirty rig, I'm like, yeah, desire and fear and grief, and I don't know.
Yeah, the question is about the categories grief, fear, and desire that I was putting on the plastic, and aren't they more like a Venn diagram, which that they all operate, which is exactly right. It's so true. And actually the original word I picked was greed instead of grief, but it quickly became clear that greed is not the elemental thing. Like greed is a symptom of some kind of deeper thing, which is maybe all 3 of those, grief, fear, and desire. Like this wanting to possess comes from something kind of more elemental, which is like maybe our mortality or something. So I think you're absolutely right. Like it's way more complicated than that. And whenever I write, thinking about one of those words, I'm immediately led to the others. But so I think if we can somehow think about those sort of elemental drives that are behind what our technology and where we are now, then maybe we can come to some kind of clues about how to address these problems. So that's the reason for my interest in those. Would you like to speak more? I want to give you a chance.
I basically said my question.
Okay.
So I have kind of a 2-part question. It sounds like you have so many more ideas about the subjects of the Greenwood, that you have so many things that you still want to express. So how did you decide when the book is done? And then the second part is, when you did decide it was done, how did the editing process go? Like, did you have to cut out pieces that were so important to you, or did you decide you had to work in more things?
So the question is about how did I know Greenwood was done, and how did I edit it to leave things out? Both great questions. The book took a shape, an intuitive shape, pretty early, and I edited it intensely as I was writing it. So I didn't have a process where at the end I went back and did a bunch of editing. I edited and cut all along. And if I were to go back, like, 'cause I can't stop, so for me, the book is not done. Like, I would go back and I edit as I read it. I would go back and cut things out now. So in some ways, the end of the book is arbitrary. And I have a friend, a writer named Kaya Sand, who taught me that the thing about a project is that it doesn't have to end with the material object, with the book. So actually, Greenwood has continued to be a presence in my life. I have continued to engage with it, which is fine. And it does not necessarily all need to be in something like a book. I mentioned the graves of soldiers in the books from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And briefly, it's not something that I dwell on a lot in the book, but one of them is named Sergeant Benke. And I got this email once from somebody named Mike Benke, and there was no subject line, and all it had was a link to a YouTube video of a tribute to Sergeant Benke. And I was like, I don't know how to take this because there's no message in it. And the book, in my view, is pretty anti-war. So I just, wrote a nice note back. Thank you for sending me that and sharing it with me. And I ended up having a friendship. It was his brother. It was Sergeant Benke's brother. And we have actually never met in person, but we have this email friendship. And he sends me a present every year. And I did a reading of the book at Greenwood Cemetery in their chapel, which was also a little bit iffy because I had been trying to get them not to spray pesticides, and it looked like for a while they weren't going to let me come into the cemetery, but they did let me come to a reading, and all of Sergeant Benke's family was there. And really, it's literally like a few sentences, one page of the book. But it was interesting to me that, the text it leaves my body and becomes what it is for other people. It was very important to his family that he was being remembered and had this presence in the world, and they took what they needed from that. And I really appreciated that and learned from it too.
I was wondering what your relationship to this plastic archive that you're holding in your home is, and what kind of weight and space it occupies there, and whether or not you commune with it, and if so, how often.
So she's asking about my plastic archive, what kind of space it takes up, how I commune with it, what's my relationship to it. So it's in plastic garbage bags in my shed, and there are 4 or 5 of them at this point. I don't like it. I wish that I didn't have the responsibility for all this plastic. I'm not sure what to do with it. It's not recyclable, so at some point it will outlive me. So it's like people who own parrots. You could burn it, but it will still go into the atmosphere and then extend way beyond my body. So I'm not sure how to curate it. I don't interact with it that much. A filmmaker came and we dumped it all out, and she did some film of it. I may do something with it. I really am actually not a very visual person, and so I love the art that's made of plastic. I'm really interested in it, but it's not my instinct. I'm much more about the language. So I don't really know. I'm mystified. I have a fantasy of traveling around the country with my car part. All the Honda Odysseys in the U.S. are now made at a plant in Lincoln, Alabama, and I've called Honda corporate headquarters to ask them about my car part, and you can imagine the reception I get. They think I'm crazy and they hang up on me. And I've also called the Honda plant in Lincoln to see if they could give me any clues about where this car part came from. Also, they don't want to talk to me, but I want to travel with my car part there and go to the doors and be like, I was bequeathed this piece of plastic that will last for hundreds of years. Will you please, I want to know about it and how to care for it and what to do about it. It's just a kind of, then get carted off and stuff. But I think that if we really thought about the plastic and other kinds of waste in our lives in terms of the all the implications that it has, like the fact that carbon dioxide is going to stay up in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, we'd be paralyzed, right? If we actually did that. I think, an important exercise. So.
I just want to share a video with you that you might like. It's a TED Talk that this guy does, and thinks like maybe he'll take on a project of making something that feels very disposable, cheap, and widely available. So he chooses a toaster, and he gives himself like a year to do the project. And like he has to go back and make everything from scratch. And he takes apart the toaster and realizes that there's like over 120 pieces in it. They're all made from different things, so already you wouldn't have enough time to do it in a year. So he like chooses 5 parts to make from it, and he has to like make the shell out of plastic and like find a way to make his own plastic in his backyard, and like makes, you know, like has to go find copper in a mine. And one interesting thing that came out of it is that the smaller and smaller the scale of production is, the farther and farther back your technology has to go. So he's like going into archives to look at like ancient ways to like get copper out of water because he's not using like industrial tools. And it's really interesting.
Did everybody hear that? Ted talk about toasters? Sounds amazing. Do you think if we... Oh yeah? What's the book called?
I think it's just the Toaster Project.
Yeah, that sounds
Simon.
The Toaster Project. That sounds amazing. And then if you think you can buy a toaster at Walmart for $4.99, that, you know, what our skewed sense of worth things.
You said that the Autobiography of Plastic was sort of one project. You didn't know what it was, but then you started writing poetry and you'd get back to it because you had a grant or something. And I'm wondering about what you think the form of poetry, how it fits with research or the history, or are those two different forms, or do the poems become your autobiography of plastic as plastic, or?
Maybe they do. I don't know. I think poems are more plastic than prose, to use the term in another sense. Shaw is asking about the relationship between documentary and poetry. Well, you know, I wrote all of Greenwood and then ended it with a poem, and I think this is obviously this is a similar trajectory. I think in some ways, at least just for me, and this is personally, that poetry is a way for me to tap into and express more intuitive, felt connections. I'm very interested in, obviously, in research and science and my father's a physicist, and documentation, like that attracts me and it draws me, and learning about the world. But I feel like poetry has a power that, like I was saying about Alice Notley, takes that line directly into my gut so that I can express that. And in some ways that's smarter than I feel like any research I can do, because I'm feeling something before I know it, like with Autobiography of Plastic. So poetry allows me to tap into that, and it could be that that's what the autobiography is. I don't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo something that Ben was saying about you coming here. This book, Greenwood, has been really powerful for me and other people I've been talking to. But my question is about, you mentioned briefly distrust of language that you have. I'm kind of forgetting the context. It might have been when Sai was asking about the negation that you were doing, the last part. But that kind of resonated with me, and I'm wondering if you could describe that distrust a little more. And then also maybe I sort of wanted, or I was seeing in it also a faith in that you're persisting with language. So maybe you could talk about that.
The question is about the distrust of language that I mentioned. So I was writing Greenwood in the context of the months and years after September 11th, when there was a lot of rhetoric from our political leaders that seemed so clearly false. There was a lot of classic, what they call doublespeak, right? The George Orwell idea of doublespeak, where you're saying something that literally means its opposite, and talk about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And language was so repulsive and so obviously false, and so being used as an instrument of harm, that I was feeling very repulsed by language and what it could do, but also stuck. Here we are, right? We are lingual creatures. This is one of the key ways we find out about the world and communicate about it. So I also wanted to learn about the history of where I was living and how we got to this place. And so I needed to rely on other people's language, and felt an urge to express in language of my own. So I think a lot of writers have that sort of complicated relationship with language, that it's so double-edged.
you maybe talk, we've been wading around in, as I said, the Arcades project in my program, and talking about ways of doing history. And Greenwood is a way also of doing history that we've been exploring. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, and you described Susan Howe and Alice Notley and people who've been influences, but it seemed to us in our seminar that Arcades project is also an antecedent of Greenwood, although we had sort of come to the idea that the constellation of Greenwood is more concentrated in a certain way. It's not a notebook. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with the Arcades project in a formal sense.
Yeah, so Miranda's asking about Walter Benjamin's book, The Arcades Project, and alternate, well, you didn't say the word alternate, but ways of doing history. And I think what was so powerful and inspiring to me about the Arcades Project is that it's a magical way of doing history, a poetic way of doing history. The poets always love Walter Benjamin, who is a philosopher, because he's very poetic in his philosophy. He makes really brilliant, wonderful, intuitive leaps and has an intuitive understanding of the world that's so sensitive that he can really zero in on sort of things in the culture that are important symbols that other people haven't narrowed in on, like the arcades in Paris, which were these sort of inside-outside walkway kind of things. So I think that Benjamin was a model for going ahead and like being magical about your history, like making leaps that other people might think were kind of outrageous. And that's a way of doing the sort of fragmented, juxtaposed way of doing history that ranges in ways that people might feel are sort of far-fetched, like orangutans in Borneo, in a book that's about a 19th century cemetery in Brooklyn. I think Benjamin helped give me the freedom to do that. And I think that's also related to the distrust of language. It's the distrust of that kind of master narrative of history, the very authoritative historical voice with a single narrative line that has dominated so much of our history, although now that's, of course, being cracked open. So I wanted to do that cracking open and that magical kind of connection in my own work. And Benjamin was permission for that and a model in a lot of ways. Have we exhausted ourselves? No, we have another.
I was wondering how you balance or manage your paid gig with environmental work and your poetry, and I was wondering if you see a connected political relationship between them.
Say a little bit more about that part.
I guess maybe your thoughts on poetry functioning and activism. You talked a little bit about your poetic investigations leading to like what can we do differently?
Right. Okay. Thanks. I'm glad you asked that. So he was asking about the balance of work, paid work, and creative work. It's tough, like all balancing is. I used to think of balancing as being like the still point that you reach where everything's good, but it turns out, like a dancer told me, that balancing is a constantly readjusting and is never still, which was a really helpful metaphor for me. So I am always accommodating and reaccommodating ways to have a creative life while also having to feed myself. And very practically, one of the things I do is wake up early, which I don't really like. I'm not necessarily a morning person, but if I can do the things that are the most important things to me before I do things for everyone else, then I get them done. So I wake up early and write for 2 hours before I start my paying work. So that's one thing. It's hard, and it requires constant adjustment. And I wish, on behalf of all artists, we lived in a culture that valued art more, and the power art has in terms of advancing our understanding of the world and ourselves. So that's kind of related to the other piece of your question about my poetry in relation to activism. I think I work for an environmental organization that really values practical results, as they should, because that's their job and that's what people give them donations to do. But I also think it's equally important for us to think about how we got here and and imagine alternative ways of existing. And to me, that seems an important function of art that's just as important. So I see them as being related in that way, if not direct activism. I think we've come to the time, right? Thank you so much, everyone. It was such a privilege. Thank you. Thank you.